The plan required precision, patience, and a basic understanding of geology, all of which, thankfully, Ted possessed in abundance. For 3 consecutive nights, they worked under the cover of darkness, transforming the seemingly innocent stretch of lawn into what Ted affectionately called a hydrological masterpiece. The beauty of it, Ted explained as they labored, is that we're not damaging anything. We're simply redistributing the natural soil layers and adding a bit of bentonite clay, Mother Nature's own slippery little secret. The ingeniously devious setup was invisible to the casual observer. Ted had helped Diane excavate 6 inches of topsoil from the area where Karen habitually parked, replacing it with a carefully engineered mixture of clay, sand, and water-absorbing polymers. They topped it off with sod and a thin layer of regular soil, creating a picturesque green surface that looked completely normal, until weight was applied to it, like quicksand, but more controlled, Ted explained. The compression activates the mixture. The more someone struggles, the worse it gets. Diane spent the next morning installing a discreet irrigation system that could be controlled from her phone, allowing her to saturate the ground at will. By the time she finished, her lawn looked better than ever, a verdant tract disguised as perfect suburban landscaping. The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 days, Karen's Range Rover remained conspicuously absent from Diane's lawn. Diane began to worry that somehow Karen had sensed the trap, that perhaps Ted had been spotted during their nighttime engineering sessions. On the 4th day, Diane awoke to the familiar sound of tires on grass. Heart racing, she grabbed her phone and peered through the blinds. There it was, the white Range Rover, parked in its usual spot, right in the center of their modified terrain. Diane quickly activated the irrigation system, sending a slow, steady stream of water into the soil beneath the vehicle. Then she made coffee, settled into her porch chair, and waited. 45 minutes later, Karen emerged from the house across the street, designer handbag swinging from her arm, keys jangling in her manicured hand. From her strategic vantage point, Diane watched as Karen approached her vehicle, completely oblivious to what was about to unfold. The moment Karen opened the driver's side door, she seemed to notice something was wrong. She paused, looking down at her feet, where her expensive leather pumps had sunk almost an inch into what had appeared to be solid ground. Frowning, she stepped back, then forward again, testing the surface. What on earth? Karen's voice carried across the quiet morning air. She attempted to enter her vehicle, planting her foot more firmly, which only caused her to sink deeper. Confusion turned to alarm as Karen found herself suddenly ankle-deep in what had moments ago seemed like ordinary lawn. When she tried to extract her foot, she lost her balance, instinctively reaching for the car door for support. The slight shift in weight distribution was all it took. The Range Rover, already sitting on compromised ground, began to tilt ever so slightly to one side as its tires sank unevenly into the specially prepared soil. "No, no, no," Karen shrieked, her composure shattering as she watched her $90,000 vehicle begin a slow-motion descent into Diane's front lawn. By now, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, attracted by the commotion. They gathered at a safe distance, torn between concern and poorly concealed amusement. Karen turned toward them, mascara already beginning to streak. "Don't just stand there. Someone do something." Nobody moved. For months, they had all suffered under Karen's arbitrary rules and regulations. Now they simply watched in collective silence that spoke volumes about neighborhood solidarity. Ted appeared beside Diane, coffee mug in hand. "Fascinating," he murmured. "It's working exactly as the soil mechanics equations predicted." "How long until it stops sinking?" Diane whispered back. "Oh, it should stabilize about 8 inches down," Ted replied. "Enough to require a tow truck, but not enough to cause any actual damage to her vehicle." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully, just enough to make a point. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Diane Holloway awoke to the sound of her prized hydrangeas being crushed beneath radial tires. She bolted upright in bed, coffee forgotten, and sprinted to her front window just in time to see a gleaming white Range Rover with custom HOA license plates parked halfway across her meticulously maintained lawn. Again. Third time this week, Diane muttered, pulling her robe tighter as she marched outside, morning dews soaking through her slippers. The vehicle's owner was nowhere to be seen, but Diane knew exactly who it belonged to: Karen Westfield, self-appointed queen of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association and resident of 42 Maple Lane. Karen had moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago and wasted no time establishing herself as a force of suburban tyranny. Within weeks, she'd become HOA president through a special election that suspiciously occurred while half the neighborhood was away for spring break. Since then, life in the previously peaceful community had transformed into a constant stream of violation notices, mandatory landscaping requirements, and passive-aggressive neighborhood-wide emails. Diane snapped several photos of the Range Rover from different angles, making sure to document the deep tire tracks cutting across her lawn. As she did, a text message arrived on her phone. Had to run to an emergency board meeting. Nowhere else to park. Your grass will be fine. Key. The audacity nearly caused Diane to throw her phone into the birdbath. This wasn't a matter of convenience. 42 Maple Lane had a perfectly functional driveway and garage. This was about power, about Karen demonstrating that rules apply to everyone except her. Diane had already tried the reasonable approach. She'd spoken to Karen directly, sent polite emails, and even proposed designated guest parking at the last HOA meeting, which Karen had promptly tabled for future consideration. The Range Rover continued to appear on her lawn at least twice a week, always accompanied by dismissive excuses. The final straw came later that afternoon, when Diane returned from work to find a violation notice taped to her door. The offense? Unsightly lawn damage inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards. The fine, $150. The suggested remedy, immediate resodding at Diane's expense. The notice was signed with Karen's flourishing signature and a smiley face sticker. That evening, as Diane sat on her porch swing nursing a glass of Merlot and staring at the muddy tire tracks, her neighbor Ted Wilson wandered over. Ted was a retired civil engineer with a perpetual twinkle in his eye that suggested he knew more than he let on. "Noticed you got the royal treatment again," he said, nodding toward the damaged lawn. "And a fine for the privilege," Diane replied, holding up the violation notice. Ted settled into the chair beside her, thoughtfully stroking his silver beard. "You know, in my line of work, we always had to consider water management. Fascinating subject, really. Especially when you understand how certain soils, when properly prepared, can seem perfectly stable until they're under pressure." Diane lowered her wine glass. "What exactly are you suggesting, Ted?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he replied with a casual shrug that didn't match the mischievous gleam in his eyes. "Just making conversation about soil composition, and maybe mentioning that I still have some equipment in my garage from my last project. Equipment that might be useful for someone interested in landscaping innovations." For the first time in weeks, Diane felt a smile spreading across her face, not the polite, neighborly smile she wore to HOA meetings, but something far more dangerous. "Ted," she said, refilling his wine glass, "tell me more about these landscaping innovations." The next morning, Diane was startled by a knock at her door. She opened it to find Karen standing on her porch, dressed not in her usual business attire, but in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "I'd like to help fix your lawn," Karen announced without preamble, "since I'm the one who damaged it." Diane blinked in surprise. "That's unexpected." "Look," Karen said, shifting uncomfortably, "I know I've been difficult. Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start after my divorce, but I think I went overboard trying to control my new environment." She gestured vaguely toward the neighborhood. "I was so focused on making everything perfect that I forgot communities are about people, not just properties." The admission wasn't elegant or rehearsed, which somehow made it more genuine. Diane found herself nodding slowly. "Lawn repair is a 2-person job at minimum," she finally said. "I've got tools in the garage." They worked side by side for most of the morning, removing the sabotaged soil section and replacing it with proper topsoil and fresh sod. The physical labor seemed to dismantle the remaining barriers between them, and by the time they broke for lunch, they were exchanging remarkably candid observations about life in Oak Ridge Estates. The thing is, Karen admitted as they sat on Diane's porch steps sharing sandwiches, I actually know most of my enforcement was ridiculous, but once I started, it was like I couldn't stop. Every time someone questioned a rule, it felt like they were questioning my authority. Power does strange things to people, Diane acknowledged, especially when they're already feeling powerless in other areas of life. Karen glanced at her sharply. That's perceptive. I went through a divorce too, Diane explained. 3 years ago. Threw myself into garden competitions afterward. Something about being able to control at least one perfect square of universe. The conversation was interrupted by Ted strolling over, eyebrows raised at the unexpected tableau of cooperation. Well, he said, taking in the freshly repaired lawn and the 2 dirt-smudged women. Looks like my services as neighborhood soil engineer are no longer required. Your secrets are safe, Diane assured him with a laugh. Though I think Karen's figured out most of them already. Actually, Karen said, standing up and brushing off her jeans, I was hoping to consult both of you on a new project. She hesitated, then continued with growing confidence. The community center landscaping is terrible. All those water-hungry plants in our climate make no sense. I was thinking we could propose a redesign. Something more sustainable with native species. Ted's eyes lit up. I've been saying that for years. I know, Karen admitted. I read all your letters to the previous board. They were in the archives. They made a lot of sense, actually. As they began to discuss possibilities, other neighbors gradually joined the impromptu planning session. Marcel arrived with soil samples. Evelyn brought architectural sketches from a similar project in her previous community. By late afternoon, what had begun as lawn repair had evolved into an enthusiastic community redesign committee meeting, with Karen, to everyone's surprise, taking detailed notes rather than dictating decisions. 2 months later, the transformation of Oak Ridge Estates was well underway. The community center showcased a beautiful xeriscape garden that had reduced water usage by 60%. The revised HOA rules, now enforced by a rotating committee, emphasized communication over punishment, and the monthly neighborhood gatherings, once sparsely attended formalities, had become genuine community celebrations. Karen's Range Rover, repaired and gleaming once more, was now always properly parked in her driveway or the designated visitor areas. But the real change was in Karen herself. The rigid perfectionism remained, but it had been redirected into organizing efficient meetings, drafting clear communications, and, most surprisingly, mediating disputes between neighbors with a newfound appreciation for compromise. The HOA emergency meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock that evening in the community center, a time deliberately chosen to maximize attendance. By 6:30, the parking lot was full, and by 6:45, it was standing room only inside the usually half-empty meeting space. Karen arrived precisely at 7, her normally perfect hair slightly disheveled, her Range Rover conspicuously absent. The heavy equipment required for its extraction had caused further damage to her vehicle, necessitating transport to a specialized repair facility. Whispering ceased as Karen made her way to the podium at the front of the room. For a moment, watching her straighten her shoulders and arrange her notes, Diane almost felt a twinge of sympathy. Almost. Before we begin, I want to address the unfortunate incident that occurred this morning, Karen began, her voice betraying only the slightest tremor. While I appreciate everyone's concern, I must point out that what happened represents a serious safety issue that affects our entire community. Soil instability could impact property values and... Point of order. Ted interrupted, rising from his seat in the back row. According to the agenda distributed via email, tonight's meeting was called to address apparent inconsistencies in HOA regulation enforcement. The stability of Diane's lawn is not on the agenda. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to respond. As president, I have the authority to amend the agenda as needed for community safety. Actually, said Evelyn Santos, The retired attorney from Willow Street who had spent weeks combing through the HOA bylaws. That's incorrect. Section 4, Paragraph 12 clearly states that emergency meeting agendas cannot be modified without a 2/3 majority vote of attending members. She adjusted her glasses. I move that we proceed with the original agenda. Seconded. At least a dozen voices called out simultaneously. For the next 2 hours, resident after resident approached the microphone, describing their experiences with selective rule enforcement. Marcel presented a slideshow documenting identical violations that had resulted in drastically different consequences depending on Karen's personal relationship with the homeowner. Ted provided an analysis of HOA fund allocations, showing a statistical correlation between proximity to Karen's home and infrastructure improvements. Throughout it all, Karen's expression gradually transformed from defensive indignation to growing alarm as she realized the extent of the unified front arrayed against her. By the time Diane approached the microphone, the outcome was already clear. "I'm not here to add to the list of grievances," Diane said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "We all make mistakes, especially when we're new to positions of authority. What matters isn't that rules were broken, but how we respond when those inconsistencies are brought to light." She turned to face Karen directly. "I think we've all had enough of keeping score and holding grudges. What our community needs isn't perfect enforcement. It's communication, fairness, and mutual respect. Sometimes, that starts with a simple acknowledgement that things could have been handled better." The silence that followed was electric with possibility. Every eye in the room turned toward Karen, giving her a chance, perhaps her final chance, to salvage the situation. For a long moment, Karen remained frozen behind the podium, her knuckles white against the wooden edge. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, something in her posture changed. Her shoulders lowered slightly. The rigid line of her mouth softened. She began, then stopped, clearing her throat. "I may have been overzealous in my approach to certain matters." It wasn't quite an apology, but in the context of the evening, it felt like a seismic shift. Diane caught Ted's eye across the room, receiving an approving nod in return. By meeting's end, 3 new board members had been elected to assist Karen in her duties, effectively diluting her unilateral authority. A committee was formed to review all outstanding violations and fines. And Karen, in a move that surprised everyone, volunteered to chair a new communication task force designed to improve transparency between the board and residents. As the crowd dispersed into the warm evening air, Diane found herself walking beside Karen in the parking lot. "You're alone," Karen said suddenly, not making eye contact. "Did you really engineer that whole situation?" Diane smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say I decided to take an active approach to water management." By mid-morning, Oak Ridge Estates had transformed into an impromptu block party. Neighbors who normally only exchanged polite waves were now gathered in lawn chairs along the sidewalk, sharing coffee and donuts as they watched the unfolding drama. Someone had even set up a small refreshment table, complete with a donation jar labeled Tow Truck Fund. Though the growing pile of bills suggested most contributions were more about making a statement than providing actual assistance. The Range Rover now sat at an awkward angle, its right side sunk nearly a foot into the deceptive ground, while its left side remained relatively elevated, giving the luxury vehicle the appearance of a sinking ship. Karen, having tried everything from placing boards under the tires to enlisting reluctant neighbors to push, had retreated to make a series of increasingly frantic phone calls. "I've been on hold with my insurance company for 20 minutes. She complained loudly to anyone who would listen. This is outrageous. This is property damage. This is sabotage." Diane maintained a carefully neutral expression as she approached Karen, offering a glass of lemonade. "Looks like you're having a rough morning. Thought you might need this." Karen glared at her with naked suspicion. "You did this somehow, didn't you?" "Did what?" Diane asked innocently. "Provide you with refreshment during a difficult situation." "Yes, I plead guilty to basic neighborliness." "You know exactly what I mean," Karen hissed, her voice dropping to ensure the gathering crowd couldn't hear. "My car doesn't just sink into perfectly normal grass. Diane took a thoughtful sip of her own lemonade. You know, it's the strangest thing. I've been meaning to talk to you about the lawn situation. After receiving that violation notice, the one about unsightly damage from tire tracks, I did some research on soil compaction. Apparently, repeated pressure on the same spot can cause serious structural issues with the underlying ground. Something about destroying the soil's natural porosity. That's ridiculous, Karen snapped. Lawns don't just collapse. Under normal circumstances, no, Diane agreed pleasantly. But when someone repeatedly parks a 3-ton vehicle on them, she let the sentence hang unfinished between them. A tow truck finally arrived around noon, its driver surveying the scene with the weary expression of someone who had seen it all. His initial attempt to simply pull the Range Rover free proved ineffective, the wheels spinning helplessly in the slick clay mixture underneath the grass. Going to need the heavy equipment for this one, he announced after several failed attempts. Got to stabilize the ground first, then extract the vehicle. Might take a few hours. Karen's face contorted with fury. A few hours? Do you have any idea how much I'm paying you? The driver shrugged, unmoved by her outburst. Physics don't care about your hourly rate, ma'am. This earned appreciative chuckles from the audience of neighbors, several of whom had now set up lawn chairs for maximum viewing comfort. As the tow truck driver made his preparations, Marcel Dubois, the neighborhood's most vocal gardening enthusiast and frequent recipient of Karen's violation notices for his excessively French landscaping choices, approached Karen with exaggerated concern. Such a terrible situation, he said, his accent thickening with theatrical sympathy. Perhaps while you wait, you might want to review this. He handed her a stapled document with flourish. What is this? Karen asked suspiciously. A petition, Marcel replied. Signed by every household in Oak Ridge Estates. We're calling for an emergency HOA board meeting to review certain, shall we say, inconsistencies in how regulations have been applied throughout the neighborhood. Karen's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages of signatures. You can't do this. I'm the president. For now, Marcel agreed pleasantly. Though I believe the bylaws you so frequently cite allow for leadership reviews under certain circumstances. Section 7, Paragraph 3, if I'm not mistaken. As Karen sputtered in indignation, Diane exchanged subtle nods with several neighbors. The plan was working even better than they'd hoped. Karen's predicament had united the neighborhood in a way that months of shared grievances had failed to do. On the anniversary of what residents now jokingly called the sinking, Diane hosted a neighborhood barbecue. As evening fell and conversations flowed as freely as the wine, she found Karen sitting alone on the porch swing, watching the proceedings with a thoughtful expression. Penny for your thoughts? Diane asked, settling beside her. I was just thinking about how differently things could have turned out, Karen replied, if you'd gone with a more conventional approach to handling our disagreement. Diane laughed. You mean if I hadn't turned my front lawn into a vehicle trap? Exactly. It was creative problem solving. I'll give you that. Sometimes people need to sink before they can rise, Diane said with a shrug. I took a gamble that you had depths worth exploring. Karen was quiet for a moment, swirling her wine thoughtfully. I'm still not convinced you didn't break several county regulations with that soil mixture. Probably, Diane agreed cheerfully. But as someone once told me, rules are meant to serve the community, not the other way around. Karen raised her glass in acknowledgement of the gentle rebuke. Touché. Though I should warn you, I've been researching local ordinances in my spare time. There are some fascinating gray areas around temporary landscape modifications. Planning a counterattack? Diane asked. Only half joking. Planning ahead, Karen corrected with a hint of her old precision. The best revenge might be a swamp trap, but the best community builders know when to drain the swamp and when to dive in together. As they clinked glasses, neither noticed Ted watching them from across the yard, his expression both satisfied and slightly alarmed at the possibility of what these two formidable women might accomplish or engineer next. The end.